Welcome to Uncloseted Conversations. Even if you stumbled upon this channel by accident, you are welcome here. The stories here are from my heart, from my soul, from my pen to your ears. I hope that you will stay a little longer and open yourself to the magic of storytelling. Here I write fiction, and though not always aligning with reality, it still tugs at heartstrings. Stories are escapes and sometimes a balm to the soul. So, enjoy your time here, and if reality presses down too loud and too hard, come knock at the door, come in, take a seat, grab a coffee, and just exhale. These are veil-bound stories, and the space is free and non-judgmental. Sit back, earphones or pods in, and let's listen to another exquisite romance. The Labyrinth of 47th Street. Justice has a frequency. Love has a rhythm. Enter the mind of a master. Exit as a different person. Chapter 1. The Labyrinth of Pain. The warehouse on 47th Street smelled of rotted timber and old grease, but for the 5 men collapsed on the concrete floor, it smelled like their own burning flesh. Wo-young-sure stood in the center of the gloom, a silhouette of terrifying stillness. She didn't hold a blade. She didn't carry a gun. Her hands were folded loosely at her waist, her breathing so rhythmic and deep it seemed to pulse against the corrugated metal walls. "Please," gasped the one named Rico. He was clawing at his thighs, his fingernails drawing real blood from skin he believed was dissolving in acid. "Make it stop. The fire. Get it off me." Wo-young didn't flinch. Her voice, when she spoke, possessed the silver needle quality, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly against the base of the skull. "The fire is in your mind, Rico," she said, the tone clinical and cold. "But your mind cannot tell the difference between the thought and the flame. You felt powerful when you trapped my niece in that alley. Now, feel the weight of the space you've built for yourself. The signature, the ghost strike." Rico's associate, a man twice Wo-young's size, lunged from the shadows with a tire iron. Wo-young didn't turn her head. As he swung, she executed a ghost strike. To a bystander, it would have looked like a glitch in a video stream. She was there, and then she was 3 inches to the left, the iron whistling through empty air. With a movement as fluid as silk caught in a draft, she tapped 2 fingers against the man's carotid artery, not to bruise, but to disrupt. "Sleep," she commanded. The man didn't just fall, he wilted. His nervous system, hijacked by the suggestion of total exhaustion, simply shut down. The labyrinth deepens. She turned her gaze back to Rico. He was backed against a rusted pillar, eyes blown wide, staring at his own hands. The hallucination changed. His bones were turning into glass and shattering. He could hear the crunch of every movement. "You want the police, Rico?" Wo-young asked, stepping into the sliver of moonlight filtering through the roof. Her face was a mask of ancestral discipline. "The police will give you a cell with 4 walls. I am giving you a cell with no exit. Every time you close your eyes, you will feel the cold steel of the needle you thought you used on her. Every time you breathe, you will taste the salt of her tears." She leaned in, her qigong-trained presence so heavy it felt like the atmospheric pressure in the room had doubled. "Tell me everything. Who else was there? Or should I show you what it feels like to have your heart stop and then start again?" Rico broke. It wasn't a shout, it was a pathetic, whimpering confession that spilled out of him like bile. He scrambled toward the exit, not to escape, but to find the first uniform he could surrender to. Wo-young watched him stumble into the night. The stillness returned to the warehouse, but her hands were shaking. The Grandmaster had done her duty, but the ant was bleeding inside. Chapter 2. The Psychological Siege. Wo-young-sure didn't stand like a fighter. She stood like a statue carved from cold moonlight. Her hands weren't balled into fists, they hung at her sides, fingers slightly curled as if she were plucking invisible strings in the air. I didn't do nothing," the man on the floor whimpered. His name was Miller, a jagged man with a soul like broken glass. He was trying to crawl away, but his legs refused to move. To him, the floor had turned into a sea of waist-deep tar. Woyang took a breath. It wasn't a normal breath. It was a qigong draw, pulling the air deep into her lower abdomen, compressing it until her entire chest cavity acted as a resonator. When she spoke, the silver needle signature manifested, a sound that didn't travel through the air, but vibrated through the marrow of Miller's teeth. "You are lying to yourself, Miller," she said. Her voice was a low, melodic hum that felt like a physical weight pressing on his chest. "And because you lie to yourself, your mind has forgotten how to tell the truth to your body." She didn't strike him. She simply stepped forward, her footfalls silent, yet with every step, the flickering overhead light seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. "Look at your hands," she commanded. Miller looked. He screamed. To his hijacked brain, his skin was peeling back like wet parchment, revealing clockwork gears and rusting iron beneath. He began to claw at his own forearms, trying to stop a pain that didn't exist in the physical world, but was screaming through his synapses. "That is the sound of Xiao's fear," Woyang whispered, moving into his blind spot with a ghost strike, a movement so deceptively fast it left a visual smear in the air. "It is a gear that will never stop turning. Every time you close your eyes, you will hear it grinding." The weight of mastery. Behind her, 2 other men charged. They were fueled by a cocktail of adrenaline and terror. Woyang didn't even turn. She shifted her weight, a microscopic adjustment of her center of gravity, and exhaled a sharp, focused burst of air, a ki that wasn't a shout, but a sonic shockwave. The air in the warehouse seemed to ripple. The men stumbled, clutching their ears as their equilibrium shattered. They didn't fall because she hit them. They fell because she had convinced their inner ears that the world had tilted 45 degrees. She turned back to Miller. He was sobbing now, a broken heap of a man staring at a reality that was melting around him. "The police are coming," Woyang said, her voice dropping to a silk-thin thread. "They will put you in a room. But I am the architect of this room in your head. I have removed the doors. I have removed the windows. You will live in that alleyway with her over and over until your mind forgets your own name." She reached out and touched his forehead with a single finger. The contact was light as a feather, but to Miller, it felt like a branding iron. "Give me the name of the one who led you," she whispered. "Or I will leave the lights off in here, forever." The aftermath. When the name finally broke from his lips, it was a strangled, desperate sound. Woyang stepped back, the silver needle resonance fading from her throat. The warehouse returned to its mundane, grimy reality. The tar vanished, the gears disappeared. But Miller remained curled in a fetal position, his eyes vacant, staring at a floor he no longer believed was solid. Woyang walked toward the exit, her silhouette shivering in the doorway. She had won. But as she stepped into the cold Chicago rain, she tasted copper in the back of her throat, the price of using the art for vengeance. Chapter 3: The Temple of Iron and Silk. The memory didn't start with a punch. It started with a sound. Mount Chicheng, China. 23 years ago. 6-year-old Woyang stood on a stone plinth no wider than her own small feet. Below her was a drop into a mist-shrouded ravine that swallowed the sound of the crashing river. Her master, a man whose skin looked like cured leather stretched over ancient bone, sat 5 paces away. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching a single incense stick burn. "The wind is not your enemy, Woyang," Master Zifeng whispered. His voice didn't fight the mountain gale, it wrote it. "The wind is a suggestion. If you believe the wind can move you, it has already won." The internal forge. The training wasn't about muscle, it was about neurological sovereignty. For 12 hours a day, she was forced to hold a single posture, the Zhanzhuang. Her legs burned like they were filled with molten lead. Her vision blurred. But the moment she wavered, Master Zifeng would strike a bronze bowl. The sound was the precursor to her current silver needle signature. It was a sharp, piercing frequency that felt like a physical spike driven into her ear canal. "Your mind is a house with many doors," he would say, his voice weaving into the vibration of the bowl. "If you leave them unlocked, any ghost can walk in. If you lock them too tight, you will suffocate. You must learn to be the one who holds the keys." The first breach. The torture began when she was 10. Master Zifeng sat her in a dark room. He began to hum a low, rhythmic drone that mimicked the delta waves of deep sleep. Luoyang felt her eyelids grow heavy. She felt her body go numb. Then, the hallucinations started. Master Zifeng wasn't hitting her body, he was hitting her perception. He made her believe the room was filling with freezing water. She felt the phantom chill creep up her ankles, her knees, her chest. She gasped for air, her lungs burning with the knowledge that she was drowning. "It is not real," she sobbed, her small hands clawing at the dry air. "To your heart, which is racing at 140 beats per minute, it is the only reality," Master Zifeng said calmly. "Find the glitch, Luoyang. Find the one thing in this room that cannot be wet." She had to learn to find the anchor, a single point of objective truth, the smell of the incense, the texture of her own sleeve, to shatter the illusion. She learned to build labyrinths in her own mind to trap the fear he sent her way. The burden of the key. By the time she was 14, she could walk through a fire she knew wasn't there without a single blister forming. But the cost was a growing isolation. She saw the world not as solid objects, but as a series of mental constructs that could be folded, bent, or broken. She moved to America at 16, a girl who could stop a man's heart by whispering the right frequency into his ear, trying to live a life where the most dangerous thing she handled was a rolling pin and yeast. Chapter 4. The Ghost in the Machine. The leader's name was Vane. He lived in a penthouse that was a monument to stolen things, glass walls, Italian leather, and a security system that cost more than a suburban home. The cameras were high-definition, infrared, and motion-activated. As Luoyang moved through the hallway, the sensors hummed, but the hard drives recorded nothing but the steady, rhythmic pulse of an empty corridor. She didn't hide from the lenses. She moved in the blind spots of the refresh rate, her qigong-trained breathing so shallow it didn't even stir the dust in the air. She stepped into Vane's bedroom. He was sprawled on 1,000 thread count sheets, the deep, heavy sleep of a man who believed he was untouchable. Luoyang stood over the leader of the gang. He was lying on his back, his breathing shallow and regular, his eyes closed as if in a midday nap. But his eyelids were flickering in rapid eye movement, REM. Inside, in the architecture Luoyang had built for him, he was being buried alive in a coffin made of the very shadows he used to hide in. Every breath he took felt like inhaling graveyard dirt. He was sleeping, and he would never want to wake up, because in the dream, the torture was logical. In the dream, he deserved it. Luoyang didn't touch him. She sat down in a designer chair in the corner of the room, her hands folded. She began to hum. It was a sound below the threshold of human hearing, a subsonic frequency that resonated with the liquid in the inner ear. The internal execution. Vane's eyes flew open, but he didn't see his bedroom. In his mind, he was back in the alley. But this time, he wasn't the predator. He was small, smaller than Xia. The walls of the alley began to grow, stretching toward a dark sky until they were miles high. The brickwork turned into thousands of tiny, biting mouths. "Who's there?" Vane screamed, but in the physical room, his lips didn't even twitch. He lay perfectly still, his heart rate spiking to 160 beats per minute while his body remained paralyzed in a REM state lock. Luoyang leaned forward, her silver needle voice weaving into his nightmare. "You liked the feeling of someone being unable to move, didn't you, Vane? Now feel the weight of every brick in Chicago pressing against your chest." Inside the hallucination, Vane felt his ribs crack. He felt the phantom sensation of needles, thousands of them, threading through his nerves. He was being tortured by his own nervous system, triggered by the precise auditory cues Luoyang fed into the silence. The digital lie. Later, the police would play back the footage. They would see Vane tossing slightly in his sleep at 3:14 a.m. They would see a door drift open as if by a stray draft and then click shut. They would see no one. But when Vane finally woke at 5 a.m., he didn't run for his gun. He crawled to the nearest precinct, weeping, begging to be put into the deepest, darkest hole in the state. He claimed a woman with eyes like the moon had peeled his skin off for 1,000 years. The detectives looked at the footage of his peaceful, empty bedroom and shook their heads. "He's had a psychotic break," the lead detective muttered. Guilt finally caught up to him. Or the drugs. Chapter 5. The Shattered Cup. Luoyang returned to the bakery, the Golden Grain, while the sun was still a bruised purple over the Chicago skyline. The smell of yeast and burnt sugar usually calmed her, but today, it felt like ash. She found her sister, Zhuang, sitting at the small kitchen table, a chipped porcelain cup of tea gone cold between her hands. Upstairs, the house was too quiet. "Did you?" Zhuang didn't finish the sentence. She looked at Luoyang's hands. They were clean. No blood. No bruised knuckles. "He will never hurt anyone again," Luoyang said, her voice sounding thin and hollow to her own ears. "It doesn't matter," Zhuang whispered, a tear finally breaking. "She won't come out of the room, Luoyang. She won't eat. She looks at the door like she's waiting for the floor to open up and swallow her. You broke the man, but the fear is still here." Luoyang looked at the stairs. She had used her gift to destroy, a technique she had sworn to her master she would only use in the direst need. Now she realized the art of iron had reached its limit. She needed the art of silk. The first healing. She entered Xia's room. The girl was curled into a ball, staring at the wall with eyes that saw only the alleyway. Luoyang sat on the edge of the bed. She didn't reach out to touch her yet. She knew that even a kind touch could feel like a strike right now. Instead, she began to breathe. A soft, rhythmic, oceanic sound. "Xia," she whispered, her voice no longer a needle, but a warm blanket. "Listen to the sound of the rain. Only the rain." As she spoke, she began to use a healing qigong, variant of her hypnosis. She wasn't building a labyrinth this time. She was building a garden. She began to guide Xia's mind away from the gray bricks and the cold rain of the alley, toward a memory of the bakery, the smell of cinnamon, the warmth of the ovens, the safety of the flour-dusted counters. "The alley is a shadow, Xia, and shadows cannot survive the light." Slowly, for the first time in 3 days, Xia's breathing hitched, synchronized with Luoyang's, and her grip on the pillow loosened. Chapter 6. The Architecture of Recovery. The transformation of the Golden Grain didn't happen with a sledgehammer, it happened with a whisper. For weeks after the incident, the neighborhood was haunted by the story of Vane. The man who had ruled the block through terror was now a vegetable in a state psychiatric ward, reportedly screaming at shadows that only he could see. But inside the bakery, Luoyang was doing the opposite of breaking a soul. She spent every evening in Xia's room. She didn't use the silver needle voice. She used the silk thread, a cadence so soft it mimicked the rhythm of a mother's heartbeat. "The memory is a room, Xia," Luoyang would say, her hands moving in slow, circular qigong patterns that seemed to settle the very air in the bedroom. "You do not have to live in the room where the light is broken. We are going to build a new one. One with windows. One with a door that only you have the key to." Under the hypnotic guidance, Xia's tremors stopped. The night terrors faded. By the 3rd week, Xia was back downstairs, her hands white with flour, helping her mother knead the morning dough. The accidental dojo. The dojo began because Xia couldn't keep a secret, not from her friends. It started with Maya, a girl from Xia's class who had been mugged 2 months prior and hadn't walked to school alone since. Then came Mrs. Gable, whose grandson was being bullied by the remnants of Vane's crew. They didn't come for martial arts. They came for the peace they saw in Xia's eyes. "Teach us," Maya whispered one afternoon after the bakery had closed. The girls were standing in the clearing of the storage room, surrounded by sacks of grain and the smell of roasting coffee. "Teach us how to not be afraid. How to make our minds strong like yours." Wo-young looked at her hands, the same hands that had trapped a man in a permanent nightmare. She didn't want this. She wanted to bake bread. "I am not a teacher," Wo-young said, her voice firm. "You saved me," Auntie Xia said, stepping forward. Her voice was steady for the first time in a month. "But I don't want to just be saved. I want to know how to stand. I want to know how you move like the wind." Wo-young looked at the faces of the neighborhood girls, eyes full of the same flickering shadows she had seen in her own mirror for years. She realized she couldn't just lock the doors to the temple anymore. "Clear the flour sacks," Wo-young commanded, her voice shifting into the authoritative tone of her master. "If you want to learn to be the wind, you must first learn to be the mountain." Chapter 7. The Architect Arrives. Matsuyama Raicho didn't just show up. She arrived like a calculated strike. She stepped out of the black SUV, her Italian-made heels clicking against the pavement with a rhythmic precision that sounded like a metronome. Born in Milan to a Japanese diplomat and an Italian sculptor, Matsuyama grew up in a world of hard and soft. She understood the rigidity of steel and the fluid grace of marble. Moving to America at 16, the same age as Wo-young, she had to rebuild her identity from scratch. She didn't have a dojo, she had a drafting table. She became an architect because she wanted to control the space around her. If she built the room, she knew where the exits were. The lot across from the Golden Grain wasn't just a random piece of real estate. It was part of the Neo-Zen Project, a high-stakes urban renewal initiative Matsuyama had fought for years to lead. The soil in this part of Chicago was soft and prone to shifting. Most architects feared the foundation would crack. Matsuyama saw it as a metaphor. She wanted to build a floating tower, a structure that used its own weight to create stability. The neighborhood was a melting pot. Matsuyama's design wasn't a glass box. It was a fusion of Japanese minimalism and Italian Baroque, ornate but functional. She wanted this building to be her masterpiece, the bridge between her two heritages. Matsuyama had a sixth sense for energy, what her grandfather called ketsunyaku. When she looked at the maps of the city, this specific block felt like a pressure point. It was a place where things were either going to break or be reborn. The first glimpse. As Matsuyama looked over her blueprints, she felt a distortion in the air. She looked up and saw Wo-young through the bakery window. To anyone else, Wo-young was just a woman in an apron dusting a counter. But to Matsuyama, a woman who lived by the golden ratio, Wo-young was a revelation. The way Wo-young moved wasn't human, it was geometric. Her spine was a perfect vertical axis. Her shoulders were perfectly level. When she turned to speak to a customer, she didn't just move her head. She rotated her entire center of gravity with a fluid efficiency that Matsuyama usually only saw in high-end Swiss machinery. "Who owns that bakery?" Matsuyama asked her assistant, her voice carrying a slight Italian lilt over a Japanese cadence. "A local family. The Sure family." "Why? Is there a problem with the property line?" Matsuyama didn't answer. She watched Wo-young catch a falling glass, not by grabbing at it, but by placing her hand exactly where the glass was going to be before it even left the counter. "No problem," Matsuyama whispered, her eyes narrowing with professional and personal curiosity. "But I think I need to adjust my plans. This building needs to face that window. I want to see how she does that." Chapter 8. The Blueprints of Silence. The bell above the door of the Golden Grain gave a sharp, brassy ring that usually signaled the start of the morning rush. But when Matsuyama stepped inside, the sound didn't echo. It seemed to be absorbed by the air itself. Matsuyama stopped 3 paces from the threshold. Her Italian leather heels, which usually announced her arrival like a percussion section, felt suddenly loud, obscene, even. She clutched her leather portfolio to her chest, her thumb tracing the embossed logo of her firm. Across the counter, Shi Luoyang was wiping down a wooden surface. She didn't look up immediately. Her movements were a slow-motion dance of efficiency, circular, grounded, her weight shifting from one foot to the other with such fluidity that the flour dust on her apron didn't even puff into the air. Then Luoyang stopped. She placed the cloth on the counter and lifted her head. The silence that fell between them wasn't empty. It was heavy, like the air before a summer storm. For Matsuyama, the world outside, the honking of Chicago taxis, the grinding of the construction drills, the frantic digital pulse of her emails, simply ceased to exist. Matsuyama felt a sudden, sharp memory. Kyoto, age 9. Her grandfather had taken her to a Zen rock garden after her mother's funeral. She remembered the absolute, terrifying stillness of the raked sand. She remembered how her own heartbeat had seemed to slow down to match the rhythm of the stones. She hadn't felt that stationary center in 20 years. Not until now. Looking into Luoyang's dark, steady eyes, Matsuyama felt her own frantic internal architecture begin to settle. The construction, Matsuyama started. Her voice, usually a sharp instrument of command, cracked slightly. She cleared her throat, trying to find her professional footing. I am Matsuyama Raicho, the lead architect for the Neo-Zen project across the street. I came to discuss the impact of the foundation drilling on your storefront. Luoyang didn't blink. She observed Matsuyama not as a threat, but as a structural entity. She saw the tension in the architect's jaw, the slight tremor in her hands, the way she held her breath in the upper part of her chest. The drilling will vibrate the earth, Luoyang said. Her voice carried that silver needle resonance, but it wasn't sharp today. It was a low, grounding hum. But if the foundation is deep enough, the walls will not notice. Matsuyama felt the words vibrate in the marrow of her shins. It was an impossible sensation. I've spent months calculating the vibration dampening, Matsuyama whispered, stepping closer to the counter. The smell of the bakery, warm yeast and star anise, wrapped around her like a physical embrace. But there is something about the way you stand, the way this room feels. It doesn't match the maps. Luoyang allowed a ghost of a smile to touch her lips. She recognized the look in Matsuyama's eyes. It was the look of a builder who had finally found a line that was truly straight. Maps only show the surface, Ms. Raicho, Luoyang said softly. They don't show the roots. For a long minute, neither woman moved. The sunlight through the window caught the flour dust in the air, making it look like suspended gold. It wasn't just attraction. It was a recognition of discipline. Matsuyama saw in Luoyang a woman who had mastered herself. Luoyang saw in Matsuyama a woman who was desperately trying to build a world she could finally feel safe in. Would you like a coffee? Luoyang asked, breaking the spell just enough to let Matsuyama breathe again. The impact can wait until the steam settles. Matsuyama nodded, her heart finally finding a steady, rhythmic beat. Black. No sugar. Please. As Luoyang turned to the espresso machine, Matsuyama watched her back, the way her spine acted as a perfect conductor for her energy. Matsuyama realized, with a start, that she didn't want to just build a tower across the street. She wanted to know how a human being could become a sanctuary. Chapter 9. The Sound of the Falling Body. The espresso machine hissed, a plume of steam rising to meet the sunlight. Luoyang's hands were steady as she reached for a ceramic cup, her back to Matsuyama. Then came the sound. Thud. It wasn't a soft sound. It was the heavy, vibrating impact of a human body meeting a reinforced mat, followed by a sharp, collective intake of breath. For Matsuyama, whose childhood in Italy had been punctuated by the sudden, violent noises of city streets, the sound triggered a primal reflex. "Is someone hurt?" Matsuyama gasped, her portfolio slipping an inch. Wo-young didn't flinch. She didn't even turn around. She continued to pour the dark, oily liquid with a hand that remained perfectly horizontal. "The floor is stronger than it sounds, Ms. Raicho." Again, a voice rang out from behind the heavy velvet curtain that separated the storefront from the storage. It was Sia, but not the quiet, traumatized Sia Matsuyama had heard rumors about. This voice was crisp, commanding, and centered in the lower lungs. "If your mind wavers, your feet will follow. Stand like the mountain." Matsuyama couldn't help herself. The architect in her, the one who needed to see the source of every structural vibration, moved before she could think. She stepped around the counter, her heels clicking rapidly, and pulled back the corner of the curtain. The storage room had been transformed. The flour sacks were stacked neatly against the brick walls, acting as makeshift soundproofing. In the center of the cleared space, 6 young women stood in a circle. Sia was in the middle. Her eyes were closed. Opposite her was Maya, a girl twice her size, who was currently picking herself up off a blue mat. "I didn't even see you move," Maya panted, her face flushed with a mix of frustration and awe. "I didn't move," Sia said, her voice dropping into a low, vibrating hum that Matsuyama recognized instantly. It was a mirror of Wo-young's. "I just stopped being where you thought I was." Matsuyama watched, mesmerized. The girls weren't wearing traditional gi. They were in leggings and oversized t-shirts, but their posture was terrifyingly disciplined. They moved with a geometric precision that made Matsuyama's professional heart skip a beat. Every angle of their limbs, every shift of their weight, was a study in perfect structural integrity. "They are learning to build walls," a voice whispered directly behind Matsuyama's ear. Matsuyama jumped, spinning around. Wo-young was standing there, holding 2 cups of coffee. She had moved across the room in total silence, the ghost strike applied to a simple walk. "Walls?" Matsuyama asked, her breath coming in short, jagged bursts. "Internal ones," Wo-young said, handing a cup to Matsuyama. Her eyes stayed on the girls, but her focus was entirely on the architect standing inches away. "The kind that don't crumble when the world outside gets loud. You build them out of steel and glass, Ms. Raicho. I teach them to build them out of breath and will." Matsuyama looked at the coffee, then back at the girls, then finally into Wo-young's eyes. The peace she had felt minutes ago was now tempered with a sudden, electric thrill of danger. She realized she wasn't just standing in a bakery. She was standing in a fortress. "This isn't just self-defense," Matsuyama whispered, her Italian accent thickening with her rising heartbeat. "This is something else. You are training them to be invisible. I am training them to be seen only when they choose to be," Wo-young corrected softly. For a long moment, the 2 women stood at the edge of the curtain, the architect of the city and the architect of the soul. Matsuyama felt a sudden, desperate urge to put down her blueprints and join the circle. She wanted that stillness. She wanted to know what it felt like to have a foundation that couldn't be shaken by a drill or a memory. "I think," Matsuyama said, her voice barely audible over the sound of the girls' rhythmic breathing, "that my construction project is going to be much more complicated than I anticipated." Chapter 10. The Resonance of Glass. The evening air was thick with the scent of ozone and lake-effect rain. Matsuyama had stayed late at the bakery, her blueprints spread across a flowered table as she and Wo-young discussed the structural integrity of the neighborhood. "I have to go," Matsuyama said, her voice softer than it had been in years. "My driver is waiting around the corner." "Be careful, Ms. Raicho," Wo-young said, her eyes tracking a shadow moving across the street. "The streetlights on this block have a habit of flickering when they shouldn't." Matsuyama stepped out into the damp night. She had only walked half a block when the silence changed. It wasn't the peaceful silence of the bakery, it was the predatory silence of a hunt. The ambush. 3 men stepped from the mouth of an alley. They weren't the disorganized thugs Vane had employed. These men moved with a military rhythm, heavy boots, leather jackets, and eyes that held the dull sheen of professional collectors. The architect, the lead man, rasped. He was a mountain of a man named Kale, a former enforcer for the syndicate that had backed Vane. "You're building something expensive on our land. We think there's a tax you haven't paid." Matsuyama backed away, her heels catching on a crack in the sidewalk. "I have permits. I have the city's backing. The city doesn't live in the dark, lady." "We do." Kale stepped forward, reaching for her leather portfolio, the one containing the master plans for the Neo-Zen project. Matsuyama closed her eyes, bracing for the impact. She felt the rush of cold air as Kale lunged. There was no sound of a struggle, no grunt of effort. One moment, the space between Matsuyama and Kale was empty. The next, Luo Yangshi was simply there. She hadn't run, she hadn't shouted. She had used the ghost strike movement, sliding through the blind spots of their vision until she materialized like a phantom out of the Chicago mist. She stood between Matsuyama and the men, her hands tucked into the pockets of her cardigan, her breathing so slow it didn't even mist in the cold air. "The sidewalk is public property," Luoyang said. Her voice carried the silver needle vibration, amplified by the brick walls of the alley. It sounded like 1,000 bees humming inside the men's skulls. "But the air around this woman belongs to me." "Move, baker lady," Kale growled, swinging a heavy fist. Matsuyama watched, breathless. Luoyang didn't fight in the traditional sense. As Kale's fist approached, she didn't block it. She executed a microscopic pivot of her hips, a movement so subtle it looked like she had barely shifted, and the fist whistled past her ear. She tapped Kale's elbow. A light, almost delicate touch. Kale let out a strangled scream. To Matsuyama, it looked like nothing. To Kale, Luoyang had used Qigong to send a vibration through his ulnar nerve that felt like a bolt of lightning. His arm went limp, hanging at his side like a dead weight. You're that witch," the second man stammered, backing away. "The one who broke Vane." "Vane broke himself," Luoyang said, stepping forward. With every step, the men flinched as if she were swinging a blade. He looked into the mirror I held up, and he didn't like what he saw. "Do you want to see your own reflection?" She began to hum a low, terrifying frequency that made the glass in the nearby streetlights vibrate. Matsuyama felt the hair on her arms stand up. The very atoms in the air seemed to be screaming. The men didn't wait for the hallucination to take hold. They turned and bolted into the darkness, their boots pounding a frantic rhythm against the pavement. Luoyang stood still until the sound of their footsteps faded. Then, she turned to Matsuyama. The terrifying master mask melted away, replaced by the quiet baker once more. "Are you hurt?" she asked softly. Matsuyama was trembling, but not from fear. It was the adrenaline of seeing something so impossible, so beautiful. She reached out, her fingers brushing the sleeve of Luoyang's cardigan. "You appeared, out of nowhere," Matsuyama whispered. "I've studied physics, Luoyang. I've studied the way mass moves through space. What you did, it shouldn't be possible." "The mind sees what it expects to see," Luoyang replied, her eyes searching Matsuyama's. "They expected an empty street. So, I became the street." Matsuyama looked at the bakery, then back at the woman who had just defended her life with a hum and a touch. She realized that her project, the Neo-Zen Tower, was no longer her priority. "Teach me," Matsuyama said, her voice steadying. "Not just how to build walls. Teach me how to be the street." Chapter 11. The Blueprint of the Soul. The transformation of the storage room happened almost overnight. Matsuyama didn't just bring a checkbook, she brought a team of silent, high-end contractors and a set of custom-engineered designs. She replaced the sagging wooden beams with reinforced carbon steel, hidden behind reclaimed cedar to maintain the Zen aesthetic. She installed acoustic dampening panels that looked like minimalist art, ensuring that the silver needle frequencies stayed within the walls. "This isn't a bakery storage room anymore," Wo-young said, walking across the new sprungwood floor that Matsuyama had insisted on, designed specifically to absorb the impact of a falling body. "It's a sanctuary," Matsuyama replied, her Italian-tailored blazer tossed over a flour sack. She was holding a laser level, her eyes tracing the perfect horizontal line of the new mirrors. "If you are going to train these women to be invisible, they need a space that respects the physics of their movement." The first lesson, unlearning the steel. That evening, after the construction crew had vanished, Matsuyama stood on the mat. She had traded her Prada heels for bare feet and her silk blouse for a simple black training shirt. For the first time in her life, the architect felt structurally unsound. "You stand like a skyscraper, Ms. Raicho," Wo-young said, circling her. "You are all tension and vertical force. If an earthquake hits a skyscraper, the building survives by swaying. If it is too rigid, it snaps." Wo-young stepped behind her. She didn't touch her, but Matsuyama could feel the heat radiating from Wo-young's palms, the qigong energy creating a localized pressure. "Close your eyes," Wo-young commanded. "Don't think about the steel in your bones. Think about the water in your cells." Matsuyama closed her eyes. She tried to find the center, but her mind kept jumping to the Neo-Zen project, the syndicate threats, and the legal hurdles of the city. "Your mind is cluttered with blueprints." Wo-young's voice dropped into that melodic, hypnotic hum. "Let them go. Imagine the floor isn't solid. Imagine you are floating in a dark, warm sea." As Wo-young spoke, she began to use a gentle version of her hypnotic resonance. Matsuyama felt her heartbeat slow. The tension in her neck, the executive's knot began to unravel. For a moment, the world didn't have any walls. There was only the sound of Wo-young's breathing and the scent of sandalwood. "Now," Wo-young whispered, "move with me." She placed a hand on Matsuyama's waist and another on her shoulder to guide her into a basic qigong stance. The contact was electric. It wasn't the violent energy of the street fight. It was a slow, grounding current that made Matsuyama's breath hitch. Matsuyama opened her eyes. They were inches apart. In the reflection of the new mirrors, they looked like a single entity, one dark and fluid, the other pale and focused. "I've spent my whole life building things to keep people out," Matsuyama whispered, her Italian lilt soft and vulnerable. "I don't know how to be open." "Opening a door doesn't mean the house is weak," Wo-young replied, her thumb grazing the fabric of Matsuyama's shirt. "It just means you're ready for a guest." The moment was broken by a low vibration, not from the art, but from Matsuyama's phone on the bench. It was a text from her lead foreman at the construction site across the street. "Site compromised. Someone broke into the sub-basement. They didn't steal anything. They left a mark." The syndicate wasn't going away. They realized that to get to the architect, they had to go through the baker. Chapter 12. The Silent Pulse. The Neo-Zen construction site and the Golden Grain were no longer two separate entities. They were the heart and lungs of a new kind of territory. Under Matsuyama's architectural guidance, the streetlights were replaced with smart LED grids that pulsed at a specific, calming frequency, one that Wo-young had calibrated to mimic the alpha wave state of a relaxed mind. To a stranger, the street felt unnervingly quiet. To a predator, the street felt like a trap. In the reinforced dojo, the silent army grew. It wasn't just Xia and her friends anymore. It was the single mothers, the shopkeepers, and even the elderly women who lived in the brownstones. Wo-young didn't teach them how to throw a haymaker. She taught them the architecture of presence. "If you fight with your fists, you have already lost the element of surprise," Wo-young said, her voice echoing in the acoustically perfect room Matsuyama had built. "You fight with the space between you and the enemy. You fight with the silence." She had the women practice synchronized breathing. 30 women, breathing in perfect unison, created a subsonic hum that physically vibrated the floorboards. It was a collective application of the silver needle. The eyes of the street. Matsuyama integrated the defense into the very fabric of the neighborhood's renewal. She installed a mesh network of cameras that didn't just record video, they tracked biometric deviations. If someone's heart rate spikes or their gait becomes aggressive, Matsuyama explained to the group, pointing to a sleek monitor in the back office, the streetlights will subtly shift their hue to a cool blue. It's a signal, not to the police, but to us. The women became the weavers. They didn't wear uniforms. They wore their everyday clothes, but they walked with a specific, grounded stride. They communicated through subtle hand signals, movements that looked like adjusting a scarf or checking a watch, but were actually high-level tactical cues. One Tuesday night, a group of syndicate scouts returned. They were looking for the weak points in the construction site. They found none. As they walked down 47th Street, the atmosphere changed. The smart lights dimmed slightly, casting long, distorted shadows. From every doorway and alley, a woman stepped out. They didn't say a word. They didn't brandish weapons. They simply stood in the zhangzhuang, standing posture, their presence heavy and unmoving. The scouts felt a wave of inexplicable dread, a fear frequency Luoyang had taught the women to project through their focused intent. The scouts' own nervous systems began to betray them. Their hands shook, their vision blurred. "This street is closed," a voice whispered from the darkness. It was Xia, standing atop a shipping container, her silhouette sharp against the moon. The scouts didn't even try to fight. They felt like they were being watched by 1,000 eyes in a forest that wanted them gone. They turned and ran, tripping over their own feet as their equilibrium failed them. Late that night, Matsuyama and Luoyang stood on the balcony of the half-finished Nyozen Tower, looking down at the quiet street. "You've turned them into ghosts," Matsuyama whispered, leaning against a steel girder. "I've turned them into owners," Luoyang replied. She turned to Matsuyama, her face softened by the blue glow of the streetlights. "You gave them the walls, Matsuyama. I just gave them the breath to fill them." Matsuyama reached out, taking Luoyang's hand. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to check the blueprints. The foundation was finally solid. "The syndicate won't take this lightly," Matsuyama said, her thumb tracing the calluses on Luoyang's palm. "They'll realize they aren't fighting a person anymore. They're fighting a neighborhood." "Let them come," Luoyang said, her voice a low, lethal hum. "The labyrinth is ready." The syndicate is realizing that their traditional methods of enforcement are failing against this psychological warfare. They are going to bring in someone who understands the old ways, perhaps a rival master or a mindbreaker of their own. Chapter 13. The Ghost in the Foundation. Elias Thorne didn't look like a thug. He looked like a sound engineer. He arrived in a nondescript van, carrying equipment that looked like it belonged at a high-end concert, but his true instruments were infrasonic emitters designed to cause nausea, paranoia, and structural fatigue. "The baker is the soul," Thorne told the syndicate leaders, his voice a flat, synthesized rasp. "But the architect is the anchor. If I can make the architect doubt the ground she stands on, the whole neighborhood will collapse." While Luoyang was leading a deep meditation session in the dojo, Thorne moved into the sub-basement of the Nyozen project. He didn't use a crowbar, he used a digital frequency bypass. Inside the steel skeleton of the tower, he began to plant resonance spikes, small devices that vibrated at the exact natural frequency of the building's steel beams. Slowly, the building began to hum. It was a sound below the threshold of human hearing, but the body felt it. In the bakery across the street, the water in the glasses began to ripple in perfect, concentric circles. Matsuyama was in her glass-walled office at the top of the construction site, reviewing the final load-bearing calculations. Suddenly, a wave of vertigo hit her. The room felt like it was tilting. The air felt sharp, like it was filled with microscopic needles. Her Italian upbringing, her years of logic, her architectural mastery, all of it seemed to dissolve into a primal, unreasoning fear. "Wo-young," she whispered, reaching for her phone, but the screen was a blur of static. She stood up, but her equilibrium was gone. The silent army sensors she had installed weren't picking up a person. They were being drowned out by the white noise Thorn was pumping into the building's nervous system. Thorn appeared in the doorway of her office. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a handheld directional speaker. "Ms. Raicho," he said, the sound of his voice hitting her like a physical blow. "You've built a beautiful cage. But you forgot that every cage has a frequency that can shatter it." He dialed a knob on his device. The silver needle resonance that Wojong used for healing was suddenly inverted. It became a jagged, dissonant scream that only Matsuyama could hear. Matsuyama collapsed, her hands over her ears. Her internal walls, the ones Wojong had helped her build, were being vibrated apart at a molecular level. "The baker will come for you," Thorn whispered, stepping over her. "And when she does, I'll have the frequency ready to turn her art into her own executioner." Across the street, Wojong stopped mid-breath. The synchronized rhythm of the 30 women in the dojo shattered. "Auntie?" Xia asked, her eyes snapping open. "Something is wrong. The air, it tastes like iron." Wojong stood up, her face a mask of cold, ancient fury. She didn't need the sensors to tell her what had happened. She could feel the void where Matsuyama's energy used to be. The anchor had been pulled. "The labyrinth has been breached," Wojong said, her voice dropping into a lethal, subsonic register that made the mirrors in the dojo crack. "Xia, take the weavers. Surround the site. No one enters and no one leaves." "And you?" Xia asked. "I am going to remind someone," Wojong said, stepping toward the door, her silhouette blurring into a ghost strike before she even reached the handle, that you should never try to outsing a master of the breath. Chapter 14. The Resonance of the Ancestors. The Neo-Zen tower didn't just hum anymore, it shrieked. Elias Thorne sat in the center of the skeletal penthouse, surrounded by oscillating monitors and high-frequency emitters. Matsuyama was slumped in a chair, her eyes unfocused, her mind caught in a feedback loop of artificial terror. "She's coming, Ms. Raicho," Thorne said, his fingers dancing over a fader. "I can feel her displacement in the air. But your master is just a biological machine. And every machine has a breaking point." Wojong didn't take the elevator. She moved through the central stairwell, a concrete chimney that Thorne had filled with nausea frequencies 17 Hz, designed to liquefy a person's sense of balance. Any other human would have been vomiting within 3 floors. But Wojong wasn't fighting the sound. She was phase-shifting. As she climbed, she began to hum. It was a low, guttural vibration from the base of her diaphragm, the Vajra breath. With every step, she calculated the frequency Thorne was emitting and produced the exact inverse with her own vocal cords. She was a walking noise-canceling unit. The air around her stayed unnervingly still. The nausea waves hit her and simply vanished. She stepped into the penthouse. The wind howled through the open steel girders, 400 feet above the Chicago streets. Thorne didn't look up. He slammed a lever forward. 7 kilohertz. The dental drill frequency. "Let's see your meditation handle this." A piercing, crystalline scream erupted from the speakers, powerful enough to crack the glass in Matsuyama's nearby desk. Wojong didn't flinch. She took a single, deep qigong draw, her chest expanding until her ribs seemed to glow through her thin sweater. Then she released a kiai, a shout that didn't come from her throat, but from her soul. "Shin!" The sound wasn't a scream, it was a physical shockwave. The sheer acoustic pressure of her focused breath hit Thorne's primary emitter. The speaker cone didn't just tear, it disintegrated into black confetti. You used toys to mimic the thunder, Luoyang said, her voice now carrying the full, terrifying weight of the silver needle. I was born in the mountain where the thunder begins. Thorn scrambled for his backup, a handheld pain inducer. I've studied your biorhythms. I know your heart rate. I can stop your pulse from here. You've studied the map, Luoyang said, executing a ghost strike that left Thorn aiming at an empty silhouette. But you've never walked the land. She appeared behind him, her hand glowing with the friction of her own internal energy. She didn't strike his head. She touched the great hammer point at the base of his neck, the junction of all yang energy in the body. She didn't use a machine. She used her own nervous system to send a command directly into Thorn's brain. See the truth, Elias, she whispered. Thorn's eyes rolled back. In a heartbeat, he wasn't in a penthouse. He was in a void. He saw Luoyang's training, the years of standing on a stone plinth in the freezing rain, the decades of holding a single breath until her blood felt like fire, the ancestral lineage of thousands of masters who had passed this art down through blood and silence. He saw the depth of her discipline. Compared to the ocean of her spirit, his machines were just pebbles thrown into a lake. Thorn collapsed. He wasn't dead, but his mind had been rebooted. Every frequency he had ever memorized was gone, replaced by the single, steady heartbeat of the woman standing over him. Luoyang turned to Matsuyama. The high-frequency static in the room had vanished, replaced by a profound, heavy silence. She knelt by the chair and placed her palms over Matsuyama's ears. She began to hum the silk thread, the healing resonance. The walls are back, Matsuyama, Luoyang whispered. And they are stronger than before. Look at me. Matsuyama's eyes cleared. The vertigo vanished. She looked up at Luoyang, flower-dusted, lethal, and infinitely gentle, and she didn't see a baker. She saw the only structure in the world that could never be broken. I heard you, Matsuyama whispered, her voice trembling. Under all that noise, I heard your heart. Chapter 15. The Perfect Blueprint. The sun began to bleed over the Chicago skyline, turning the steel skeleton of the Neo-Zen Tower into a cathedral of light. Below, the sirens of the CPD wailed, blue and red lights reflecting off the bakery's windows. Elias Thorn was still slumped in the penthouse, his eyes vacant. He wasn't bruised. He wasn't bleeding. But when the first responding officers reached the top floor, they found him surrounded by illegal, military-grade infrasonic emitters. Hardware that was registered to a shell company owned by the very syndicate that had been terrorizing the 47th Street corridor. Detective Miles, the same man who had processed the psychotic break of Vane months earlier, stepped onto the rooftop. He found Matsuyama sitting on a crate, sipping a thermos of coffee that smelled faintly of star anise. Luoyang was standing beside her, calmly pointing out a structural vibration issue in the sub-basement. Ms. Raicho, Miles said, eyeing the shattered electronics and the catatonic Thorn. Care to explain what happened here? We got reports of a high-frequency disturbance and an unauthorized entry. Matsuyama stood up, her Italian elegance restored, though her feet were still bare. She handed him a tablet containing the building's security logs she had cleaned, with a single command from her phone minutes earlier. Mr. Thorn is a disgruntled former contractor, Detective, Matsuyama said, her voice smooth and authoritative. He broke in to sabotage the Foundation with these acoustic devices. Fortunately, my neighbor, Miss Sher, noticed the strange hum from her bakery and came to check on me. We found him like this. I believe he suffered a seizure brought on by his own equipment. Miles looked at Luoyang. She looked back with the placid, helpful gaze of a woman who spent her days kneading dough. Is that right, Miss Sher? Miller asked. The air was very loud, Detective, Luoyang said softly. I simply asked him to turn it off. He seemed overwhelmed. The police didn't find a vigilante. They found the criminal, a high-level syndicate specialist caught red-handed with illegal sonic weaponry. The victims, a world-class architect and a beloved local business owner. And the neighborhood, a community of women, the silent army who all provided identical statements. They had seen nothing but a suspicious van and had called the authorities immediately. By noon, the syndicate's legal front was crumbling. With Thorne's equipment as physical evidence of domestic terrorism and structural sabotage, the FBI moved in. The syndicate's assets were frozen, and the night of shadows was over before the first subpoena was even served. Chapter 16. The Resonance of Two. The rain had finally moved in, a steady, rhythmic drumming against the floor-to-ceiling glass of Matsuyama's private apartment atop the Neo-Zen Tower. The city below was a blur of amber lights and gray mist, but inside, the air was still and warm, smelling of cedarwood and the faint, lingering scent of Luoyang's jasmine tea. Matsuyama stood by the window, her silhouette reflected in the dark glass. She was wearing a simple silk robe, her hair down for the first time, dark waves that fell over her shoulders like Italian marble. She was safe, she was home, but her hands were still trembling. The dissonance from Thorne's machines had left a phantom ache in her bones. "The frequency is gone, Matsuyama," a voice whispered from the shadows. Luoyang stepped into the light. She had shed her apron and her heavy sweaters, wearing only a soft, linen shift. Without the armor of her bakery clothes, she looked smaller, more delicate, but her presence still filled the room like a low, resonant chord. Luoyang walked toward her, not with the predatory grace of a fighter, but with the tenderness of a healer. She stopped just inches away. She didn't reach out, she simply breathed, inviting Matsuyama to match her rhythm. "I can still hear it," Matsuyama whispered, her voice cracking. "The shaking. I feel like my foundation is still loose." "Then let me be your anchor," Luoyang said. She placed her hands on Matsuyama's shoulders. The contact was electric, but not jarring. It was a deep, penetrating heat that seemed to sink through the skin and settle directly into the muscle. Luoyang began to move her thumbs in slow, deliberate circles over the pressure points at the base of Matsuyama's neck. Matsuyama let out a long, shuddering breath, her forehead dropping to rest against Luoyang's shoulder. The architect, who had spent her life calculating loads and stresses, finally let her own weight be carried by someone else. "You spend so much time building for others," Luoyang murmured, her lips brushing against Reicho's temple. "Tonight, you don't have to be a structure. You can just be." Luoyang's hands moved down Matsuyama's spine, her touch precise and intentional. Every movement was a form of silk thread qigong, a silent communication of safety and devotion. She wasn't just touching Matsuyama, she was retuning her, smoothing out the jagged edges left by the trauma of the kidnapping. Matsuyama pulled back just enough to look into Luoyang's eyes. The moonlight caught the silver in Luoyang's gaze, the look of a woman who had seen the darkest parts of the human mind, but chose to stay in the light for this. "Why me?" Matsuyama asked, her hand rising to trace the line of Luoyang's jaw. "You could have stayed in your silence. You could have stayed hidden." "A bridge is useless if no one walks across it," Luoyang replied, her voice dropping to a low, husky register. "I spent 20 years building a labyrinth to keep the world out. But when you walked into my bakery, I realized I had been waiting for someone who knew how to read the blueprints of my heart." The kiss wasn't a collision, it was a resonance. It was the hard and the soft finally finding their equilibrium. It tasted of rain and jasmine, of long-held discipline finally giving way to a desperate, beautiful need. As they moved toward the bed, the art was forgotten. There were no silver needles, no ghost strikes, and no structural calculations. There was only the heat of skin against skin and the sound of two heartbeats finally finding the same frequency. In the quiet of the penthouse, high above the city they had saved, The architect and the Grandmaster found the one thing that neither steel nor qigong could provide, the peace of being truly known. The rain intensified, a percussive backdrop that only served to make the space between them feel more like a sanctuary. This was the one room in Chicago that Matsuyama hadn't designed for a client. It was the one space she had kept for herself, yet it felt incomplete until Wo-young's presence filled the void. Matsuyama's hands, usually so steady with a drafting pen, traced the scars on Wo-young's forearms, faint, silver lines from a childhood spent blocking real blades in the mountains. "I spent my life studying the strength of materials," Matsuyama whispered, her voice a low vibration against Wo-young's neck. "But you are the strongest thing I've ever touched. And the softest." Wo-young let out a breath that sounded like a prayer, her palms sliding up to cradle Matsuyama's face. There was no art here, no manipulation of the nervous system, just the raw, honest heat of a woman who had finally found a reason to stop being a weapon. Wo-young's thumbs traced the bridge of Matsuyama's nose, then trailed down to the corners of her mouth. This was a different kind of mapping. She was learning the architecture of Matsuyama's joy, the way her breath hitched when Wo-young touched the sensitive skin behind her ear, the way her pulse jumped against Wo-young's fingertips. "The resonance," Matsuyama murmured, her eyes fluttering closed. "It's not just in the building anymore. It's in us." Wo-young leaned in, her lips barely grazing Matsuyama's. "When two frequencies match, they don't just coexist. They amplify. You didn't just build a tower across the street, Matsuyama. You built a bridge to a version of me I thought I'd lost in China." They moved together with a fluid, slow-motion grace that mirrored the qigong they practiced in the dojo, but with a desperate, human hunger. On the bed, the silk sheets felt like cool water against their heated skin. Wo-young's movements were deliberate, each kiss a seal on a new contract of trust. In the deepest part of the night, the distinction between them blurred. The architect's logic and the Grandmaster's discipline dissolved into a singular, wordless understanding. There was no need for the silver needle or the silk thread when their hearts were finally beating in a perfect, synchronized rhythm. For the first time since she was 16, Matsuyama didn't feel the need to check the locks. For the first time since she was 6, Wo-young didn't feel the weight of the mountain on her shoulders. As the storm outside began to break, leaving only the soft drip of rain from the eaves, they drifted into a sleep that was deeper than any hypnotic trance, a sleep of total, unarmored peace. Epilogue: The Living Blueprint. 1 year later. The Neo-Zen Tower was no longer just a building, it was a landmark. Its glass reflected the changing moods of Lake Michigan, and its foundations remained the steadiest in the city. But the real change was on the ground. The legacy of the bakery. The golden grain had become the quiet heart of the neighborhood. Upstairs, Zhuang and Xia ran the business, the smell of fresh sourdough now synonymous with the safety of the block. The silent army had evolved. They weren't just defenders anymore, they were a community network. When a new family moved in, they were welcomed with a loaf of bread and an invitation to the internal architecture classes. Crime in the district hadn't just dropped, it had become irrelevant. Predators found the atmosphere of the street so uncomfortable that they simply turned around before crossing the property line. The Mediterranean horizon. On a sun-drenched terrace overlooking the Amalfi Coast, a set of blueprints lay weighted down by a smooth river stone. Matsuyama stood by the railing, a glass of Italian wine in her hand, watching the whitecaps. She looked younger. The sharp, defensive edge of her shoulders had softened into a relaxed, confident grace. "The wind here is different," Wo-young said, stepping out from the villa. She was wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a sundress, her skin glowing under the Italian sun. "It doesn't fight the cliffs. It dances with them." Matsuyama turned, pulling Wo-young into the curve of her arm. "I've finished the sketches for the retreat. I'm calling it the Resonance. It's going to be built into the rock, not on top of it. It will use the natural vibration of the sea to power the cooling system. Wo-young looked at the drawings, then up at the woman she loved. The architect had finally stopped trying to control the world and had started learning how to live within it. And the dojo? Wo-young asked with a smile. The center of the house, Matsuyama promised, kissing Wo-young's forehead. A room with no walls, just a circle of trees. Because you taught me that the strongest structures are the ones that let the light through. As the sun dipped below the Mediterranean horizon, the master and the architect stood in a silence that was no longer a shield, but a song. Thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe and like this video and follow me for more stories. You are always welcome here, and leave me a comment or a thumbs up, just letting me know if you like the story and would like more, or is there perhaps an idea that you would like to share or let me write for you.